Hello, criminal justice research methods. So this is the first lecture, and it's going to be pretty broad, and because we're research methods is how we like sort of the tools by which we develop the truths. So if you think of research methods as a toolbox, and we're all trying and aspiring to find what truth and knowledge is and what we can say definitively are facts, right? Methods is our toolbox for how we get to the facts and sort of the process by which we develop the facts. And so this first lecture is going to be a little bit abstract because I'm not talking about the specifics of the toolbox. I'm talking about sort of the structures of knowledge and how we develop knowledge and how theory engages with knowledge and sort of our ethical responsibilities as researchers to find the truth and to do it in a way that is rigorous, which is how we depend on our methods, but is also ethical, and we'll get into that later in the lecture as well. And so, yeah, this course is going to be a little different because it's not like I'm teaching you specific content. I'm teaching you skills, right? I'm teaching you how to set up a design, set up a study to get at questions that you want. And it's sort of different, but I think it's pretty exciting because once you get these skills, you'll read research in like a whole nother different way and be able to be critical. And also, as I'll talk about more in criminal justice, our discipline, there's a lot of room for practitioners. And so there's a lot of room, even if you're not going to be doing the research, to be engaging with it in a way that you feel confident. Let's go back. So why study research methods? I sort of got into this a little bit. So as practitioners, people on the ground, correctional officers, social workers, police officers, we're both consumers and producers of research. So lots of scholars are looking into how practitioners are doing things, how they're doing their jobs, and lots of practitioners research themselves and how they're doing their job. So it's like both the topic of research, but also you can adopt research and consume research to make your job better as well. And it's important as a lot of like the higher level managers, like the executive directors of nonprofit agencies or social service providers, the police chiefs, mayors, politicians, legislators, high-level people are looking into research to develop their policies and their stances and their practices, and very effective means of implementing policies and making sure that the practices and the way the organizations are set up are based off of research, and research-driven practitioner and is really, really emphasized, and especially for how things get financed, like the government provides money to nonprofits, or there's a request for service in a specific correctional institution, the government puts out a request for someone to provide services. A lot of how funding is provided is you need to show research that backs up your claims to your specific program or how you're doing your specific thing, and then you get funded. So research is really important, not only for developing best practices and doing your job better, but it's also mandatory in being able to get money to do what you want to do at the higher levels of engagement, right? And there may be findings you find that are interesting, like, Minneapolis Police Department did this specific program and it worked in this specific way. But in order to read research in the right way, you need to look at the context, and if that context applies to you, say maybe you're in Austin, Texas, and there's just like a different structure of how the program worked, or it just wouldn't be translatable. So there's different types of ways we can look at research to see if it applies to the specific goals or context that you're working in as well. And so that's what the whole point of this class is, for you to develop the skills to be able to analyze those things and be able to figure out how to adopt research, how to create research, how to engage in research. And so it was super helpful from your guys' survey. You all said that you're interested in social work, substance abuse, paralegal, public defender, and those are all definitely professions where research can play a role, especially if you want it to. But it will often play a role in the behind the scenes or the upper level management, even if you're not engaging with it. So it's a really good way to really go up the rank and file is if you have some research chops. So a little bit of landscape of the criminal justice research landscape, like I talked about. There's a lot of room for practitioners. And criminal justice research sort of started in like the 1950s, 30s, around then. And it was more focused on like grand theory. So I know maybe in your intro to criminology courses you talked about the U Chicago School and social disorganization theory and self-control theory. And those initial criminal justice scholars were really focused on the big questions, like why do people commit crime? Like what it makes them different than other people? Are there different structural things that cause crime? Are there certain societies that control crime differently, so in the most broadest sense? And so those theories were based on sociology, and sociology is pretty theoretical heavy, not as practical, and they developed. And this is, I think this is something I didn't really get a good grasp in undergraduate, but is important for you guys to know, is that like all of this knowledge gets produced in these journals, right? And the journals are led by people who are the up-and-coming scholars and who have authority on these subjects. And so it's like a whole group of people get together and they start a journal. And this is where a lot of research gets published. And I really, in undergraduate, didn't take advantage of the fact that we have access to all these libraries and all these journals, but the regular public, right, doesn't have access to them and needs to pay to get them. So there is this sort of issue with academia and access, and who gets access to knowledge, really, to read journals, to read research, right? Like most academic journals have paywalls, and you need to pay to read those things, but there's a large group of scholars who are trying to sort of change that, and I'll talk about that a little later. But yes, so as I was saying, criminal justice was really heavy sociology, which is like theory, large theory, like what causes crime in the first place in society, big questions. The units of analysis are macro, institutions, and people, and government. And then there was sort of a rise in legal and institutional perspectives. So people were critical of whether or not, if you implement a law and you have this criminal justice system, but how do people actually act? Because people act differently than according to the letter of the law, right? So how are things being implemented? And let's look at the actual statistics of these different institutions and understand how they should effectively respond to crime. So this is a more practical level of it's practical, but it's not so much individual, but it focuses more on empirical data and less so on theory, right? And more so on like how institutions work, how people adopt things. There's a very classic book called Street Level Bureaucrats, and it talks about how even if you implement a policy, the people who are implementing them have their own agendas, right? And whether or not they agree with that policy is going to influence how it turns out. So that's really that legal and institutional perspective. And then later in the history of criminal justice research landscape, there was a move towards professional application. So it was actually started by a bunch of probation workers who were like, this is all great theory, but like, how is this practical to our everyday jobs? Like, we have specific concerns that we're worried about, and we'd like to research those on more of a practical level. And you guys are doing like all these grand theories that it's hard to really figure out how we're supposed to implement that in our daily practices. So they're more focused on, like, for people who are in the thick of criminal justice and are practitioners, what research would be helpful for them to do their jobs better. And so I have in this slide sort of types of journals that each of those perspectives created. So these journals were all historically created by these academic disciplines. And then these are other criminological journals. So I hope you get the point that there's a lot of them. There's a lot of journals and a lot of different perspectives towards criminal justice and criminology. So if you want to go into research, just like, even as a practitioner, there's so many opportunities to publish, and it's sort of like since the internet developed, there's so many outlets and so many journals and articles that are being published every single day, and it's this churning, and that comes with its benefits because there's lots of opportunities for people to publish, but then it also comes with its costs, right? Because people are sort of in their own journal silos, and they pay attention to the journals that they like, and that are more in line with their perspective. So there's sort of, not gonna lie, there's divisions between people who are more focused on practical research and people who are more focused on the grand theory research, right? And often you can see like historical articles, if you read the older journals, of like academics straight up beefing with each other about this or that particular thing. So it can be entertaining to read these things, but it's also, it's also a place where people can be in conversation too, so it's interesting. So the book outlines some purposes of research, and it says, so it outlines like 4 purposes of research. One is exploration. So sometimes there's an issue or a topic which we don't really know about. Like, for example, there's been a lot of articles recently about how Black mothers have larger mortality rates when they're giving birth, right? That's something that's coming up in journals, but we don't really know why, right? So exploration can help address those things and expand on them, and that there may be really complex causes to that. There likely are structural bias, all of these things. And so this is sort of a space for exploration, and is like where new and up and coming topics, we can expand more on those things. And as the book notes, it's really important for like when policy changes being considered. So like, what are the recommendations to address that specific issue, right? Then there's also description. So if you're an executive at a nonprofit and you want to describe what it is that your program is doing, and what the demographics of the people who you're working with are, how they've changed over time, this is a really good purpose of research as well, is just to describe things. And also just like if you think about demography, which is the study of like demographics and people, it's nice to know, like, for example, New Jersey is super diverse. So what are those diverse populations in New Jersey? Something that is a real huge pillar of scholarship is the census. That's the most representative sample we have of the entire population. As we'll get more into, there's no one data mining place that can have every information about everyone at the same time. I think we're getting sort of close with the data tracking that our phones and apps have, but for researchers, there's sort of a divide between that. And also, I mean, it's just not everyone has accessibility to phones, and not everyone can be tracked and can be counted and can be doing all those things. If we had a structure where that would happen, I don't know what that would look like, but that's not the current world we live in. And so oftentimes when we're talking about research, we're talking about something that's smaller, that's tangible, that we've collected data on, and we're making generalizations about a larger population, right? And so the US Census is really helpful for that because it is, like I said, the most representational sample of the US population. And a lot of scholars depend on it to make claims, to do research. Okay. And then another one is explanation. So this is the why aspect of things. And this explanation portion is a little bit harder because it's more than just describing things. It's more than just telling people what a scope of this particular population looks like. It's why that population looks like that, right? And this is more where we get into causal methods, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks, where it's we can isolate the different variables to identify that this specific thing causes this specific thing. And then there's the application part. This is a lot of what the practitioner side of criminal justice research does, and it evaluates different programs and whether or not they fit the goals that they wanted to do. And this also is limited by the fact that there are a bunch of variables that influence how people engage in specific programs that might be extraneous to the actual program, right? So you'll commonly hear teachers say, well, I can teach, but really teaching starts at the home, right? And I can't isolate those different variables and how they influence when a student comes into my classroom, right? So this is a whole sort of discipline and think tanks focus specifically on evaluation research, but a lot of times nonprofits will do in-house research. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated because if nonprofits are doing in-house research, they're going to want to show that their programs are doing well. But if you have the right methods and you show that your programs are doing well, then that's a real strength on your part as well. But a lot of times in our field, there will be independent evaluators, like the MDRC is a big one, Vera Institute, Sentencing Policy. They provide a lot of evaluations. And then the other is policy analysis. So maybe, and this is something that legislators and people in the policy world are really interested in. So what would be the impacts of a specific law before we adopt it? Like in New Jersey, there's been this long stretch of trying to legalize marijuana for recreational use. What would be the impacts of doing so? How would that affect the economy? Would it give it a boost? Would it not? Would there still be an illicit economy that occurs? If so, would it be more dangerous, less dangerous? And so these are things that more think tanks and legislative staff and people in the policy world really, really think about. So the research process is often iterative, and what I mean by that is it goes through multiple cycles. So you'll think of a topic and it's something you want to explore, and you go in with a research question, and then you look at what other people are doing, how other people have addressed that question, and maybe your question changes. So your research has to change and you have to be more specific in the topic, or you come up with a research sort of design and structure, but things sort of fall apart. Designing a research structure doesn't mean that that's what's ideally gonna happen. For example, I mean, we're in the pandemic right now, and I was doing research in parole settings and listening and going to prisons to sit there and hear parole board hearings, and the pandemic happened, and this is not the priority, right? We need to make sure that people are healthy and okay, and that prisons are not like disproportionately increasing the rate of transmission of this pandemic and this COVID. And so those were halted, and that makes sense. So I, as a researcher, need to adjust how I'm doing those, and maybe I'll listen to audio files instead, right? So there are practical ways in which research questions adapt and change, and then there are also more theoretical and ways we look at the literature and our research questions adapt and change. And think about that when you're going into this class, because there is a final. You get to choose what your final is, but say that you do come into this class with a research question. Let's start thinking about it early on, because it may be that your research question changes over time, and that's great. That means you're learning and you're finding your own niche within the larger conversation of research, right? Because often the questions we initially have, someone might have written about it, and so maybe you see that someone wrote about it, but you don't like the way they did this specific thing, so you're going to expand on what they wrote about that question, and then you're in conversation with a question rather than like sort of asking a question on an island alone, right? So reviewing the literature, this is exactly how you would make sure you're not on an island alone asking a question that many other people have asked before, but you maybe didn't read about. So just Google Scholar is a great resource, and you can Google search your question. For example, let's say I want to look on how race affects parole decision making. If there are studies on that, I just type that in and see what articles are there and what they're talking about. And the nice thing about academic literature is there's always more sources that you can find by looking at the references at the end, right? And looking at what literature, oftentimes articles will say, like, we're expanding on this literature, this person addressed this question in this way, but we're doing this. So you can look into the citations of the articles that you're looking at, and as long as you reference them, as long as you say this person said this, you're totally fine. I know I sometimes get nervous because I'm like, I'm using the similar sources, but if you're adding to the conversation, then you should be fine in regards to making sure you're not plagiarizing and whatnot. And like we sort of talked about before the lecture began, Zotero is citation management tools are really good for this, right? Because you can go on a website and just cite your sources and make sure that you have those to make sure that you're sourcing where things are coming from rather than you claiming that those are your own ideas. And a lot of research is, like I said, being in conversation, saying this person said this and then this person said this. And it's really interesting because sometimes you'll see, like I mentioned, article beefs between scholars, and you can see them referencing each other and sort of criticizing each other's works and whatnot, and it's interesting. People are a little bit more polite now than they were in like the 50s, but if you research some 50s scholars, they go at it. So, how to read scholarly research. We've sort of touched on this a little bit. I'll do more of a demo of how I personally do it in office hours as well, but the abstract is like a perfect place to begin. If the abstract tells you the key finding, how they did it, what the topic is, where the scope is, you can get so much from the abstract. And the book recommends that you read the summary and conclusions first. Maybe that works for you, maybe that doesn't. I think that's a pretty good means to do it. And then you sort of skim the article and then read the entire article carefully. I like to just go through the article myself, noting the abstract, but this is a good sort of skimming process if you don't have enough time and you're going through a lot of articles at one time. And if you can always reach out if there are articles that you don't understand. I'm a resource for you as well. And scholarly books. So the preface, like it says, often tells you what exactly the book's going to do, in what chapter, what it's going to talk about. Also the introductions of books, preface or introduction, it'll tell you chapter by chapter, I'm going to talk about this in this chapter and that in this chapter. And so the nice thing is, if you are looking at a particular book about policing, but you only want to know about tactics of police in cars versus whatever, you can skim through to see what chapters would be relevant for you in the introduction. And yeah, a lot of times headings, tables, graphs are good places to look at because the author is trying to make a specific argument with those. And you can also just skim through. Oftentimes chapters will have conclusions at the end of each chapter, and that's really where the author is making the clear arguments of what they've been talking about. And so sometimes I like reading the conclusion of a chapter before I read the beginning of the chapter. Yeah, and like it says, so there might be specific chapters that you are interested in and not others. So if you find that the entire book is helpful after you've read the introduction, read the entire book if you'd like. If you found there were only a couple chapters that were relevant to your topic, then you can skip over those. Okay, so a research proposal is what the culmination of hopefully this class can allow you to do. And they're often really, really long. So they're like 20 pages. You're often sending them as a researcher at a think tank or in academia to like a foundation to fund the research that you're doing. So you have a budget and a schedule and a timeline. And so like a lot of research is sometimes feeling like a freelancer, right? There are specific projects you're working on with deliverable goals that you're doing. And you have to outline what the problem is. And then the literature review is you looking through the literature to see, okay, here's your problem. What are you contributing to this literature? What is your particular stance or slant or bend? How is this thing unique? What question are you asking? And you can ask the same question again and say, I'm asking the same question again because the methods that previous studies have used have not been effective in addressing it. And that may seem like difficult right now, but you'll get to the point where you can look at research and the methods that were used and say, oh, they use survey analysis, but that doesn't make any sense in this instance because they're trying to address this population. And that's a skill definitely to have. And then there's also a lot of research methods is data collection. Fortunately, there are a lot of spaces in which data collection has already been done, and you can just use it yourself how you would like to. So for example, the census, lots of academics use the census to do their own analysis, so they're not doing their own data collection. But sometimes, like nonprofits, if you're trying to do a program evaluation, you need to come up with your own data collection and how you're going to track test scores or therapeutic advances, right? How do you measure those things? And that's where measurement is a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this first couple of weeks, next week primarily. A lot of different ways that measurement is sort of the core foundations of a research project, and you want to make sure that your measurement is addressing the question that you're actually asking. So if you're asking about disposable income, but the way that you're measuring disposable income is based off of education, that might be a mismatch, right? Like there are studies that those things are correlated, but you're not really measuring disposable income in that way. Okay. And then once you have all of your measurement, your design, this sort of half, sorry, is there a laser pointer? Okay, nice, cool. So this half is the initial setup of the design, and you never want this half to influence this half, right? Your analysis should be done in a way that you're doing it and you're not going into it. You're going into it with a hypothesis, but you're not going into it doing the analysis to confirm your hypothesis. You want there to be an idea that it's possible your hypothesis might be false, and that's okay. Finding false research is not a failure on your part. It's you contributing and saying, hey, we thought this thing was this. It didn't turn out to be this. It's actually this, and explain why. There are issues in research where people will really, and we'll get into an example later, where people will have this influence their analysis way too much, and it becomes very tenuous as to whether or not they're being unbiased, right? And a lot of research is there's this larger truth, big T truth that we want to find, and we can't be putting our own biases into that to find the truth. If we are, then what we're doing is going to cause problems, is going to be a disservice to the larger population. And as researchers, we have massive responsibilities because there are so many unintended consequences that can occur if we're not like earnestly, honestly trying to find the truth in a way that is ethical. And we'll get more into that later. And so this finding the truth, at a more abstract theory level, there are this grand theory truths, and this is what, like, as I mentioned, the sociological sort of sects of criminology focus on, and these big theory concepts of like Marx and Durkheim, and these big theory guys who developed these ideas. And oftentimes the way academia is, a lot of our theory we're depending on is very Western, but there are non-Western theories too that you can do more research into as well. But theories are, at a larger sense, there's theories, and then there's sort of theoretical orientation, so how you think and frame abstract concepts and ideas and the logical constructs of those things, and those develop into assertions, and that's sort of like the above the theory, which we won't be getting into in this class, but if you take like some theory courses, that's where the discussion will get into. And then there's theory that's more at the level of where we've been learning in our like criminology courses. Like there are certain scopes and hypotheses that say, okay, social disorganization theory, if things are a specific way, these different actors, individuals within a community are actors, and if they don't feel a sense of collective efficacy with other people, which is another like type of concept, then they're not going to intervene in crime, right? That is a proposition. That's a causal relationship we're defining to explain crime. Whereas at the empirical level, we're trying to have variables that represent those large actors. So, like the individuals in the community, how do we measure those people? That's what we're trying to get closer to the truth. And we measure samples and whatnot, and we have hypotheses, and they're framed and connected to these theories, but they're in the real world. And theories are theories, but they are they're sort of things we're always building on and adjusting and whatnot. And they're guidelines or frames for how you can approach things. Oftentimes, practitioner research doesn't deal with theory, right? I have this practical question and I want to address it. Like, what are the most effective ways of making sure that people don't skip their court date, right? You can do experiments and research and you don't have to have a theory. Or you can say there is more public pressure will help push people to do so because of how we see society or whatnot. I can't think of a larger theory that will address that, but there are ways that you can incorporate theory into the practitioner level, but it's not like super necessary depending on the goals and means of what you want to be doing. But if you're into more academia, then this larger truth and theories might be a space that you get more into. And so I put this table out here so you can see that there are different levels of analysis, and that theory and the book sort of talks about like experiential versus like authority in knowledge, and sort of authority are the theories that we've adopted, and this more experiential side is the empirical side, like how can we actually measure this in the real world. Okay, so this gets into inductive versus deductive reasoning, and like I was sort of getting at, they approach theory in different ways. So inductive is often qualitative, and qualitative means that you are observing things and you're active in it. And we'll get more into like a more specific definition of qualitative, but if you think of right, so if I go into and people have developed pretty cool qualitative methods. For example, Forrest Stewart is an up-and-coming scholar, and he did an ethnography on like drill music in Chicago and how the internet and YouTube videos play into gangs beefing with each other in Chicago, right? So he went and hung out with a bunch of guys who were involved in those things and just observed. And that observation, that listening, that writing notes on the experiences that he had developed into propositions or patterns that he identified, and then could develop a theory of like, how does the social media sphere influence this violence sphere, right? And that is developing theory by doing observations in the real world. And then the more deductive is you're starting with the theory, you develop a hypothesis, and then you do an experiment, right? So this is more that the theory is top down and it's influencing what you're doing, and this is often empirical research. So this is often quantitative data that you're looking at and you're trying to measure something. So you're going into it with your parameters, with how you want to measure things, versus when you're doing qualitative methods, you just have a setting and you are there, and the focus is developed as you observe, rather than you going into it with a focus. And like we talked about, this is qualitative versus quantitative. So qualitative is non-numerical. It's narrative-driven. It's descriptive. And then quantitative is numerical. So it is, like we said, it is coming in with a focus. It has a particular focus and specification of measurements that it is doing. And they emphasize that all observations are qualitative at the outset. So like when you're developing your research question, you're probably thinking from your own experience, right? And what you've read and what you've experienced or heard about that specific thing, that those observations are qualitative, right? Because they're not numerical. It's not like you've surveyed a bunch of people for this intuitive question that you have. And a lot of times, especially in criminology, there's a very large emphasis on quantitative methods. And there are a lot of academics who will say it's more rigorous than qualitative methods, but they're both completely valid and they're both extremely rigorous. It's just different types of skills that you need to have. So oftentimes people who do qualitative work don't necessarily understand people who do quantitative, so there may be that divide, but there are also academics and researchers who are trying to merge those two spaces. And I think when you do merge those spaces, it produces like way more rigorous research, right? Because you can observe things, but then also do more quantitative analysis too in the same setting, and that really develops into really good research that builds off of each other. And so the quantitative world and the qualitative world are sort of emphasized on aggregates. So we're wanting to make generalizations about specific things. So we're not talking about individuals per se, but we're seeing how individuals play roles within different types of variables or characteristics that they have. And that's, I mean, when we're in the more practitioner lens, police officers are doing arrests and dealing with people every day, and they're not really trained or provided the resources to sit and reflect and be like, okay, I engaged with this many arrests and that many arrests, and what were the themes between the two. Obviously they do that to help their own work on the fly, but that's like researchers' jobs, is to do those things. And so there's often selection bias too. Like for example, like my mom also works at a law enforcement office, and she takes the phone calls and whatnot. So she may think that like crime is on the rise, but that's because she's seeing it every single day. She doesn't know the aggregate. She doesn't know the aggregate compared to the general population. So that's what a lot of research does. It's not focused on specific individuals and their experiences, because those are biased, right? Her experience is different than the general population. And so it's really important to look at aggregates, because if you're looking at a specific individual, there are definitely insights you can get from a specific individual, but you can't generalize about a larger population from one individual, right? You can if you have more, and the more people you have, the less error there is. And this is where we get into variables and how we categorize these different patterns and aggregates that we're seeing. Okay, so the book distinguishes between variables and attributes. So like a variable would be that income, right? And so an attribute or a characteristic would be that someone, like the types of categories within that income. So maybe there's income 20 to 40,000 a year, right? And then there's also income 70 to 80. The different types are the characteristics, whereas the variable is level of income. And so variables are how we categorize and talk about these measurements. And a lot of quantitative methods gets into causation, what causes this specific thing, what this variable causes this specific thing. So if you have a large income, then your spending is going to be larger. You need to isolate the variable sort of in between. And so the independent variable is always the thing that is the actor that is influencing and pushing, doing the causal thing to the dependent variable. The dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable, right? And so this is how causal reasoning goes. And then oftentimes, though, it's difficult because we have a whole bunch of other variables with the independent variables. So say we have income, but then there's also spending. Maybe people have children. Maybe people live in an expensive area. All of these things are influenced. The independent variable of spending is influenced by not just your income, but also all these other variables that are played into with your income. And so we need to isolate the independent variable and be able to measure it separate from the other variables that might influence your spending. And sometimes there are interaction effects. So maybe living in a specific region of the US and having a large income increases your spending. Whereas if you were in another region in the US and you had a large income, you would spend less. So that would be regional interaction effect with spending. And then there might be other examples where there's a variable that influences both your dependent and independent variable, and we'll get more into this throughout the semester, but this makes it hard to say what the causal claim is, right? Because it's hard to isolate the exact impact. And so that's the sort of causal frame of things, and we'll get into how research tries to address these issues and difficulties in figuring out what the relationships are. But there are also practical ethical concerns in research, right? If we're studying, if we're measuring populations, and oftentimes in the criminal justice field, being in a therapeutic setting, you're a mandatory reporter, right? You have to report if people are being harmed or whatnot. So maybe that person is not in your study anymore. And so things get more complicated. And there's also just a larger ethical problems of you're extracting a lot of resources from people when you are trying to research them, right? You're asking them for their time, and their time costs money, but oftentimes researchers don't have money to pay participants or whatnot. So there's this active, like, what are the costs and benefits, what you're trying to do, how is your research contributing to the larger goals and progression and influence, versus what sort of burden are you putting on your participants, right? And there's a large history of abuse and researchers like really treating people who are incarcerated like lab rats. You can feel free to look more into history on that, but like there have been, in response to that, there's been a lot of institutional adoptions and practices to make sure that we're not, like, research is power, and being in a lab coat and telling someone what to do, like, there's a lot of power to that. And oftentimes social research isn't exactly like that, but there is power in being a person designing and setting up a research design, and there are responsibilities for making sure that people are okay when you are doing that. And also, when we're working with criminal justice agencies, there's this level of access. So you want access to prisons, but if you know that a prison warden is doing something that's not ethical, and they're also your access, you have responsibilities to report those things. And that may mean that your research study is done because that specific warden doesn't want you in there anymore because you're causing problems. So there are definite ethical concerns. We're trying to do research within a world that is not like we can have people as little lab rats and put them in specific places, right? Like, we also need to be recognize people's autonomy and recognize that there are massive ethical concerns and that there are moral imperatives that we need to go into research with, right? We can't do everything just for a question. There needs to be benefits. And that also comes with experiments. Sometimes you're providing a program to people, but some people don't get the programs. And then if that could be a really beneficial program for them, those are also ethical concerns as well. And then finally, legal liability. If we're doing research on people who have previously committed crimes, maybe you get a subpoena and they want your data of who you were talking to and whatnot. And that does happen sometimes. People get sued for their data, to provide their data. So that's something you have to have in the back of your mind as well. So this is an example. I'm sure, I guess, put in the comments if you have heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment or not. So just say yes or no in the comments. And great, everyone has. But I'll do a general overview. They had people play guards and prisoners, and so they wanted to see what type of environment would develop if they just labeled people in that. And so they were trying to determine whether, like, the structure of the environment is what causes it, or if individuals cause harsh treatment in prison and dehumanizing things. So whicher is the structure of the prison, the thing that nurtures people into doing dehumanizing things, or is it the individuals within it, right? And so they constructed this prison, which was basically like a basement of a psychology building, and then they provided people $15 a day to participate, and they asked people to do a contract that they would be confined. They were like trying to set up like a fake but like pseudo type prison aspect, right? And it was sort of voluntary, but they also had like a massive like, it had to be terminated after 6 weeks because subjects were like so and like aggressively, like the prison guards were so aggressive to the prisoners, and the prisoners were really losing it psychologically, and they had like acute depression and anxiety, and they had to be released, and they couldn't even do the complete study. So the guards became really aggressive, and the prisoners were just deferred all authority to them. And that's a classic example. And your book provides this as an example too, and they say, okay, well, was what the experiment did, was it ethical? If there was all of this harm because the study had to be terminated prematurely, they had consent. People consented to this study, even if they developed acute signs of distress, and they provided group therapy, debriefing sessions, so that there wasn't like chronic stress that would occur after the fact. And this is a classic, I mean, you guys all have heard of it, so it's a classic example within social science of like how experiments work, and how when people are set in a specific setting, they like just do the role that they've been designated, right? But there have been a lot of recent studies that these methods were completely faulty, that the researchers came in with a specific agenda. They wanted people to think that if you were labeled these things, that you would snap to the roles and stereotypes of that label. But they found out that the guards knew the results the experimenters wanted, so they had incentive to be aggressive, to do terrible things to the prisoners, to act and demean them verbally and whatnot. And the guards were given directions on how to structure the space. The way that the researchers presented the experiment was that they just gave them labels and they figured out how to do it and created the structure. But no, the researchers gave very specific instructions during orientation, and the experimenters actually intervened during the experiment and told the guards how to act, like coaching them to be more aggressive. And the way that they provided this incentive structure for the guards is that the guards were set up to think that they were more being the research assistants. They weren't necessarily in the experiment. They were the people doing the experiment. And they found the academic journal that published it later recently, I think it was in 2018, also found that the researcher who was behind all of the research wrote their conclusions before any of the experiments were done. And this is what I emphasized before. You can't be writing your conclusion and the findings of your analysis when you're developing your hypothesis in your study design. The analysis, the experiment has to be completely separate. Otherwise, you're just fudging the truth, right? And that is like not only faulty methods, this was deception, this was fraud that occurred, and a lot of academic books still have this experiment and they're like, the results are completely valid, but they're not, and it has influenced policy and how criminal justice is developed. So how many of you, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this experiment, but how many of you have heard that the methods were very faulty and that the researchers actually deceived? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so not many of you do. And I don't know if you've also heard of the marshmallow experiment as well, where like kids are given marshmallows and they're supposed to figure out whether or not they want to eat it now or later, and it's supposed to be like a study on self-control. There's also been sort of updates on that as well, and whether or not that experiment was done with proper methods. They didn't find that they were like completely deceptive and like writing conclusions before the experiment started, but we are finding that these historical like experiments and methods that we've all adopted and thought are truth, if you look at their methods, they're not necessarily. And that's why methods are so important, and that's why we're in this very interesting time where researchers are now posting their data, like even if they are submitting to a journal that has a paywall, they're posting all their data and their methods online for people to see, to hold them accountable. And this is why it's so important to know methods, because had students been more prompted to go more into the methods and look at the measurements of how these studies were done, we wouldn't just adopt them as truth. And that's really important. Truth should not just be done by academics who have authority. Like, other people should be able to scrutinize the methods, ask how they set up the study, because there's like, we have a lot of responsibility, and it's not super easy, but people can fraudulently claim that they found these findings when they're not true, right? And so it's really important to do methods and to know how to do methods, because knowledge is power, and we need to hold researchers accountable too, right? Just like politicians and whatnot as well. And I think that's really important too for practitioners to be involved in research too, because they have a lot to contribute as well. And so here's this quote from this. If you want to look more into how this experiment was sort of a big lie, you can look into this article. But the article talks about how one of the sociologists went on 60 Minutes and sort of said that when it comes to rehabilitation, nothing works. And that was a big thing that a lot of people in the 70s were saying, that rehabilitation, nothing really works regarding that. We can't rehabilitate people to be more caring or empathetic, or to sort of reinvigorate things. And that had a lot of influence on policy and what types of policies were adopted. And there was sort of this shift from rehabilitation to a punitive turn in criminal justice. So our research influences policy, and if people like your specific research for political aims, they'll try and use it. So we need to make sure that the research that we're doing has good methods, which is the whole point of this course, is to teach you how to identify good methods and to be able to critique research. Because if something's coming from a journal, it has a lot, like, people believe it, right? And so I highly encourage you guys to be receptive to trying to get through like the jargon of methods, because ultimately it's being in conversation about knowledge. So besides these like large ethical snafus, there are things you can adopt to protect your research participants. So a lot of times we're working with people who are telling us pretty intense things about how they have experienced trauma and have done specific things in the criminal justice system. And it's important to keep their anonymity because we're thinking about things in the aggregate, so we don't need individual people's names. Even when we're doing qualitative methods, we use pseudonyms, we use fake names for people that we have studied, and that's to keep trust between the researcher and the participants, and also to make sure that our participants aren't identified from people reading the literature and that there is no backlash for them, right? There's this sort of difference between anonymity and confidentiality. And so you can set up your designs where you yourself don't know the specific people or aren't collecting specific information on people and their names. They're just, even when you do data collection, names can be scraped from the data, and there's just like sort of a unique identifier that you are putting in place of a name. So you yourself are sort of creating an anonymity where you are blind to who is who. And you can see this in surveys too, like the survey I gave you all was anonymous, so I had no idea who said they could access certain video or not links, or who said that they like were really excited for the course versus who said like this is a requirement, I'm not that into it. So you can blind yourself by providing designs where you can create anonymity. And then there's also confidentiality. So in qualitative methods, when you're like in the thick of having informants and talking to specific people and being with them every day and observing, you're not going to have an anonymity, right? But you can provide confidentiality and promise your subjects that you're not going to publicly identify them, right? And those are really important to ensure ethical treatment. And like I sort of mentioned, there have been a lot of sort of research snafus. Research is not immune to some controversies, and so there's like the National Research Act that developed because of the 70s and the Belmont Report, and they have developed sort of ethical guidelines for research to make sure that researchers are doing things in a moral way and trying to increase the benefits of research and reduce the costs, not only to not only like at a larger scale, but to the people we're actually researching, right? We have a responsibility to them. And so the way that this is sort of structured in academia and in government to ensure ethics are happening is there are these things called institutional review boards. Have you guys heard of these? You can type yes or no in the comments. Yes, okay, cool. Yeah, so there are these people who review proposals, and they will try to assess the risks and ensure confidentiality and welfare. And so when you're writing research proposals, you're submitting to them, and there's this sort of step, this check, where people are looking into it and making sure that there are designs that are complying with federal guidelines and whatnot. And so the certification, the human certification I have on the syllabus, that's extra credit. If you ever want to do research, something the IRBs will have you do is you need to complete that. You need to be trained to know the specifics of the ethical concerns and what the federal policies are. Yeah. And that's all I have for a lecture today. It was like sort of pretty broad and talking about larger ethical concerns and truth and knowledge and just giving you a broader framework. And I know it's a little meta because we're talking about knowledge and how to do knowledge and sort of like more of the nitty-gritty parts of knowledge rather than content specifically. But if you guys have any questions, I am happy to take them.